There is a battle inside of you, a war between who you were and who God is calling you to be. You feel it, don't you? That tension, that struggle, the weight of surrender. You know God has begun a great work in you, but at times the process feels slow. The transformation seems incomplete. You wonder, God, when will I finally see the change? When will I step into the fullness of what you've started? But let me tell you something. God never starts something he does not intend to finish. His hands are still upon you. His purpose is still alive. And today, as we lift our voices in prayer, something is about to shift. Stay with me. This might be the moment that changes everything. There comes a time in your walk with God when you must decide whether you will keep wrestling or finally let go. Surrender is not weakness. It is the most powerful thing you can do in the hands of the Almighty. When you release your plans, your worries, your doubts, and your fears into His hands, something supernatural begins to happen. The weight you have been carrying was never yours to bear. The struggles that have exhausted you were never meant to define you. But the enemy knows that if he can keep you fighting against God's process, he can keep you from experiencing the fullness of God's plan. The reason so many people struggle in their faith is that they are trying to control what was never meant to be controlled. They pray, but they do not trust. They worship, but they do not obey. They believe, but only until things get difficult. But let me remind you, faith is not just believing when things are easy. Faith is trusting when you cannot see. Faith is standing firm when the storms rage. And faith is surrendering, not because you have given up, but because you know that the one who began this good work in you will surely complete it. Think about this. When Jesus called Peter to walk on water, Peter was able to do the impossible as long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus. But the moment he focused on the wind and the waves, he began to sink. Why? Because fear entered his heart. Fear is the enemy of surrender. Fear whispers that God is not in control. Fear tries to convince you that if you let go, everything will fall apart. But let me tell you the truth. When you finally surrender, that is when God steps in. That is when the miracles begin. That is when the breakthrough comes. Look at your life right now. Look at the areas where you are still holding on. Is it your future? Is it your past? Is it your finances, your health, your relationships? Whatever it is, God is asking you to trust Him. The same God who breathed life into you, who formed you in your mother's womb, who has kept you through every storm, is the same God who will finish what He started in you. Do you remember the story of Abraham? God told him to leave his country, to step into the unknown. Abraham had no map, no plan, no assurance, except the promise of God, and that was enough. He surrendered his own understanding and walked by faith. And because of that, God made him the father of nations. But what if Abraham had refused to let go? What if he had said, Lord, I need to see the full picture before I move? He would have missed the destiny God had prepared for him. You see, the problem is not that God is not working. The problem is that we are not trusting. We pray for direction, but resist when God takes us down a path we did not expect. We ask for blessings, but reject the process required to receive them. We want to be used by God, but we are unwilling to let go of what is holding us back. But today I challenge you. Will you surrender? Will you release your fears, your doubts, your need for control? Because God is waiting. He has been waiting. He has been shaping you, molding you, refining you. The delays you have experienced were not denials. The pain you have endured was not pointless. The journey you have walked was not in vain. Every moment was a step in the process of His divine plan. And now He is asking you to trust Him completely. Some of you have been praying for a breakthrough, but your breakthrough is on the other side of your surrender. Some of you have been asking for a sign, but God is waiting for your obedience. Some of you have been longing for a move of God, but God is saying, let go and watch what I will do. Look at the life of Jesus. The greatest act of surrender in history was when He knelt in the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed, not my will, but yours be done. At that moment, He showed us the power of true surrender. And because he surrendered, salvation came to all of us. What if your surrender is the key to what God wants to do next? What if your surrender is the doorway to the miracle you have been waiting for? This is not just another prayer. This is a moment of decision. Will you continue to struggle, or will you finally lay it all down? Will you continue to fight against God's process, or will you trust him completely? The choice is yours. But remember, God finishes what he starts, and he has not forgotten you. So right now, wherever you are, take a deep breath, release every fear, let go of every doubt, lift your hands and say, Lord, I surrender, because when you do, heaven responds. When you do, chains break. When you do, the weight is lifted. And when you do, God continues the good work he has started in you. And this is just the beginning. When you surrender, you align yourself with God's perfect will. You step into the flow of his divine purpose, where nothing is wasted and everything works for your good. But the truth is, surrender is not always easy. It requires trust, complete and unwavering trust. It requires you to lay down your own plans, your own expectations, and even your own understanding. That's why so many struggle with it. They want God to move, but they still want to hold on to control. They want God to lead, but they are afraid to let go of what is familiar. They want God to bless them, but they hesitate when he asks them to step out in faith. The enemy knows that if he can keep you in a place of hesitation, he can keep you from walking in God's promises. That's why he fills your mind with doubts. That's why he reminds you of your past failures. That's why he tries to convince you that surrender is dangerous. But let me tell you something. The safest place you can be is in the hands of God. The greatest security you can have is in his will. And the greatest freedom you will ever experience is when you finally let go and trust him fully. Think about Joseph. God gave him a dream, a vision of his future. But before that dream became a reality, Joseph had to go through betrayal, slavery, imprisonment, and years of waiting. If Joseph had refused to surrender, if he had tried to fight against God's process, he would have never made it to the palace. But because he surrendered, because he trusted God, even in the darkest moments, he was elevated to a position greater than he could have ever imagined. Some of you feel like Joseph right now. You have dreams, but you are stuck in a season of waiting. You know God has called you, but you don't see how it will happen. You have promises from God, but everything around you seems to be going in the opposite direction. But hear me today. The delay is not the end. The process is not the punishment. God is preparing you. He is refining you. He is positioning you for something greater than you can comprehend. But you must surrender. You must trust that he knows what he is doing. You see, when you surrender, you don't lose control. You give it to the one who controls everything. When you surrender, you don't give up. You step into a greater plan. When you surrender, you don't become weak. You become stronger than ever, because now you are operating in God's strength, not your own. The enemy wants you to believe that surrender is a sign of failure. But in God's kingdom, surrender is the gateway to victory. Moses had to surrender his fears before he could lead the Israelites out of Egypt. David had to surrender his comfort before he could step into his anointing as king. The disciples had to surrender their boats, their businesses, their entire lives to follow Jesus. And every time they surrendered, they stepped into something far greater than they ever imagined. What if God is calling you to surrender something today? What if he is asking you to trust him with that situation you've been trying to fix on your own? What if he is saying, let go and watch what I will do? You see, surrender is not just a one-time decision, it's a daily choice. Every day you must wake up and say, Lord, I trust you more than I trust myself. I believe your plan is better than mine. I release my fears, my doubts, my control, and I place everything in your hands. When you live this way, you start to see God move in ways you never expected. Doors begin to open. Miracles begin to unfold. The very things you were striving for begin to chase after you. There are things in your life right now that God wants to do, but he is waiting for you to surrender. There are prayers that have not been answered yet, not because God is unwilling, but because he is waiting for you to fully trust him. There are breakthroughs that have been delayed, not because God has forgotten, but because He is waiting for you to let go of your way and embrace His. Surrender is an act of faith. It says, God, even when I don't understand, I trust you. Even when I can't see the full picture, I believe you are working. Even when I feel like I am losing, I know you are leading me to something greater. That is the kind of faith that moves mountains. That is the kind of faith that releases the power of God into your life. When you surrender, you allow God to shape you, and sometimes the shaping process is painful. Sometimes it requires breaking before rebuilding. Sometimes it means letting go of relationships that are not aligned with His will. Sometimes it means stepping into uncomfortable places where your faith is stretched. But every time, without fail, surrender leads to greater glory. Every time, surrender positions you for the next level. The reason many people remain stuck is that they refuse to surrender. They want God to move, but they are still holding on to their own plans. They want God to bless them, but they are unwilling to let go of what is blocking the blessing. They want God to use them, but they are still clinging to their comfort zones. But God is saying today, if you will trust me, I will take you further than you have ever dreamed. If you will surrender, I will open doors you never thought possible. If you will let go, I will pour out blessings that will overwhelm you. Look at the life of Paul. He was once a man who persecuted Christians, a man who thought he was doing the right thing in his own strength. But the moment he surrendered, the moment he laid down his own agenda and embraced God's call, his entire life changed. He went from being an enemy of the gospel to one of its greatest messengers. That is the power of surrender. It takes you from where you are and positions you for divine purpose. Some of you are standing at the edge of something great, but you're afraid to take that step of faith. You are afraid to let go of what is comfortable. You are afraid of what surrender might require. But let me tell you, whatever you give up for God, He will replace with something greater. Whatever you let go of, He will multiply in ways you cannot imagine. Whatever you surrender, He will use to bring you into a destiny beyond your wildest dreams. Right now, God is calling you deeper. He is calling you to a place of complete trust. He is asking you to lay down every burden, every fear, every hesitation, and simply say, Lord, I surrender. When you do, something shifts in the spirit. When you do, heaven moves on your behalf. When you do, chains that have held you back begin to break. This is the moment, this is the time. God has started a good work in you and He will complete it. He is not finished with you. He has not forgotten you. The process may not always make sense, but His ways are higher. His plans are greater, and if you will trust Him, if you will fully surrender, you will step into something beyond anything you could have ever asked, thought, or imagined. So right now, wherever you are, lift your hands, lift your heart, and say, Lord, I surrender. Because when you do, the work He has started in you will continue, and what He has begun, He will surely finish. Surrender is not just about giving up control. It is about stepping into divine alignment. When you surrender to God, you are not losing. You are positioning yourself for something greater than you can comprehend. But the challenge of surrender is that it often requires you to walk into the unknown. It calls you to step into a place where you don't have all the answers, where you don't see the full picture, and where you must rely on faith alone. That is why so many hesitate. They want to follow God, but they also want certainty. They want to trust Him, but they also want to know exactly how everything will work out. Yet faith does not work that way. Faith is trusting in what you cannot see, believing in what has not yet manifested, and walking forward even when the path ahead is unclear. There are things God is calling you to do, but you are hesitating because you don't have all the details. There are places He wants to take you, but you are afraid because you don't see the full picture. But if you wait until you have all the answers, you will never move. If you wait until you fully understand, you will never step into the destiny God has prepared for you. That is why surrender is essential. It is saying, God, I don't need to know every step. I don't need to have all the answers. I don't need to understand everything. I just need to know that you are leading me. And when you live like that, You walk in the supernatural. You live in the miraculous. You experience God in ways you never imagined. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his country, his family, and everything he knew and go to a land that he would show him. Notice that God did not give him all the details. He didn't give him a map. He didn't explain exactly where he was going. He simply said, go. And because Abraham surrendered, because he obeyed without hesitation, he stepped into a promise that was bigger than anything he could have imagined. His obedience led to a covenant that impacted generations. His surrender positioned him for a legacy that still speaks today. The same principle applies to you. There are things in your future that you cannot yet see, but they are waiting on your surrender. There are breakthroughs ahead of you, but they require you to trust God fully. There are blessings with your name on them, but they are on the other side of your obedience. The question is, will you trust Him? Will you surrender, even when you don't understand? Will you say yes, even when you don't see the full picture? The enemy will always try to convince you to hold back. He will try to fill your mind with fear. He will remind you of past disappointments. He will tell you that surrender is too risky. But the truth is, the real risk is refusing to surrender. The real danger is staying in a place of fear and hesitation. Because when you refuse to move forward, you forfeit the blessings God has in store for you. When you hold on to your own plans, you limit what God can do in your life. But when you let go, when you truly surrender, heaven moves on your behalf. God steps into your situation and things begin to shift. Many of you are holding on to things that God has been asking you to release. You are holding on to relationships that are not aligned with His will. You are holding on to fears that are keeping you bound. You are holding on to old mindsets that are blocking your breakthrough. But God is saying, let it go. Trust me. I have something better. The problem is, many people want God to give them something new while they are still clinging to the old. They want Him to bring fresh blessings while they are still holding on to what He told them to release. But you cannot receive what God has for you if your hands are full of what He asked you to surrender. Look at the disciples. When Jesus called them, they immediately left their boats, their nets, and their old lives to follow Him. They didn't hesitate. They didn't argue. They didn't ask for a full explanation. They simply surrendered. And because they surrendered, they walked with Jesus. They witnessed miracles. They were part of history. Their obedience led to an outpouring of God's power that changed the world. What if they had hesitated? What if they had said, Lord, let us think about it first? What if they had tried to hold on to their old lives while also following Jesus? They would have missed the greatest calling of their lives. And the same is true for you. There is a calling on your life. There is a purpose God has assigned to you. But it requires surrender. It requires obedience. It requires faith. Some of you are waiting for everything to be perfect before you surrender. You are waiting for the right time, the right situation, the right circumstances. But if you wait for perfect conditions, you will never step out. If you wait until it makes complete sense, you will never move forward. Surrender is not about waiting for things to be perfect. It is about trusting God in the middle of the uncertainty. It is about saying, Lord, I don't have all the answers, but I trust you. I don't see how this will work out, but I believe you are leading me. I don't know every step, but I surrender to your plan. There is something powerful that happens when you truly surrender. Worry begins to fade. Fear begins to lose its grip. Anxiety is replaced with peace. Because when you surrender, you place your burdens in God's hands. When you surrender, you are no longer relying on your own strength. You are leaning on His. That is why Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. When you surrender, you enter into that divine rest. You no longer have to strive. You no longer have to carry the weight on your own. You no longer have to figure everything out. Because now you are in the hands of the one who holds the universe. There are people right now who are tired because they have been trying to do everything in their own strength. You are exhausted because you have been fighting battles that belong to God. You are drained because you have been carrying burdens that He never intended for you to carry. But the moment you surrender, the moment you release it all into His hands, you will experience a peace that surpasses all understanding. Think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was facing the greatest trial of his life. The weight of the cross was before him. The suffering was unimaginable. And yet in that moment he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." That is the ultimate act of surrender. That is the greatest example of trusting God even when the path ahead is painful. And because of that surrender, salvation came to the world. Because of that obedience, the greatest victory was won. If Jesus himself had to surrender, how much more do we need to surrender? If Jesus trusted the Father completely, how much more should we trust him? There is no surrender without trust. There is no obedience without faith. But when you let go, when you fully trust God with your life, you step into a realm where miracles happen, where doors open and where divine favor surrounds you. Right now there is a moment before you, a moment to say, "Lord, I surrender. I give you my plans. I give you my worries. I give you my future. I give you everything because I trust that what you have for me is greater than what I could ever plan for myself." That is the place where transformation happens. That is the place where heaven moves. That is the place where God finishes the good work he started in you. Because he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. He will not leave you halfway. He will not abandon you in the process. He will not forget the promises he made. But you must trust him. You must surrender. You must say yes. And when you do, you will step into a life beyond anything you could have imagined. Surrender is the key that unlocks the fullness of God's purpose in your life. It is the moment you stop wrestling with God and start walking with him. The moment you stop resisting his plan and start flowing in his will. The moment you realize that holding on is actually slowing you down and releasing it all to him is what truly sets you free. The enemy wants you to think that surrender is weakness, that letting go means you are giving up. But in the kingdom of God, surrender is not defeat, it is the beginning of victory. It is the place where divine strength is made perfect in your weakness. It is the moment when the power of God begins to work in your life in ways you never imagined. There is someone right now who is struggling to let go. You are caught between what you want and what God is calling you to. You feel the tension between your desires and his will, and the battle within you is exhausting. But I want you to hear this clearly. You will never step into the fullness of your destiny until you surrender completely. Partial obedience is still disobedience. Halfway surrender is still resistance. God is not calling you to give him a portion of your heart. He is calling you to give him everything. That is where the breakthrough happens. That is where transformation begins. That is where the chains that have been holding you back finally break. There are people who are holding on to pain from their past, afraid to release it because they don't know who they will be without it. You have identified so much with your struggles that you don't know how to live without them, but God is saying, let it go. I have something greater for you. The weight you have been carrying, the burdens you have been struggling with, the wounds you have been nursing, none of it belongs to you anymore. When Jesus went to the cross, he carried all of it so that you wouldn't have to. But you must surrender it to him. You must make the choice to stop carrying what he already paid for. Look at Moses. He was a man who had every reason to believe that his past disqualified him. He had made mistakes. He had run away. He had spent years in the wilderness, hiding from the very place where his destiny awaited. But when God called him, he didn't ask Moses for perfection. He didn't ask Moses to prove himself. He simply said, go. And Moses had a choice. Continue holding on to fear and excuses or surrender to the call of God. His surrender led to the deliverance of an entire nation. His obedience opened the door for miracles that had never been seen before. What would have happened if he had refused? What if he had stayed in the wilderness, convinced that he wasn't good enough? He would have missed the greatest calling of his life. And the same is true for you. There is a destiny on your life that is waiting on your surrender. There are things God has planned for you that you have not yet seen, but they are on the other side of your obedience. Some of you are wrestling with decisions. You feel God pulling you in one direction, but your mind is telling you to stay where you are. You feel him calling you to step out, but fear is whispering reasons to hold back. But I want to tell you something today. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. Every moment you hesitate, every time you second guess God, you are delaying the breakthrough that is waiting for you. You are postponing the blessings that are already prepared. God is not asking you to understand everything. He is asking you to trust him. He is not requiring you to have all the answers. He is requiring you to have faith. Think about Peter when he was in the boat and Jesus was walking on the water. Jesus called him to come, and in that moment Peter had a choice. Stay in the safety of the boat or step out in faith. And as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he walked on water. But the moment he looked at the wind and the waves, the moment he focused on the circumstances instead of the one who called him, he began to sink. That is what happens when we hesitate in surrender. The moment we take our eyes off of God and start focusing on what could go wrong, we begin to sink into fear. We start drowning in doubt. But when we keep our eyes on him, when we move in faith, we step into the miraculous. Many of you are waiting for God to move, but he is waiting for you to surrender. You want him to open doors, but he is waiting for you to trust him enough to walk through them. You want him to bring new opportunities, but he is asking if you are ready to let go of the old ones. The truth is, God will not force you to surrender. He will not take from you what you are unwilling to release. Surrender is a choice. It is a decision to say, God, I trust you more than I trust myself. I trust your plans more than I trust my own understanding. I trust your timing more than I trust my impatience. Look at Joseph. He had a dream, a vision from God about his future. But before the promise was fulfilled, he had to go through betrayal, false accusations, and years of waiting. He could have fought back. He could have taken matters into his own hands, but instead, he surrendered to God's process. And because of that surrender, he was elevated to a position greater than he ever imagined. What if he had given up? What if he had refused to trust God in the waiting? He would have missed the fulfillment of his purpose. But because he surrendered, he stepped into everything God had promised. Some of you are in the waiting season right now. You feel stuck. You feel like nothing is moving. You feel like you have been faithful, but you are not seeing the results. And the temptation is to take control, to force things to happen, to move ahead of God. But hear me, the moment you try to take control, you step outside of God's timing. The moment you try to manipulate the outcome, you step outside of his perfect will. And anything you obtain outside of his will, you will have to sustain in your own strength. But what God gives, he sustains. What he ordains, he blesses. But you must trust him. You must surrender to his timing. You must allow him to complete the good work he has started in you. There are people listening right now who are tired because they have been trying to make things happen on their own. You have been striving, pushing, and exhausting yourself, trying to bring things to pass in your own strength. But God is saying, let me do it. Stop striving and start trusting. Stop worrying and start resting. Stop fighting battles that belong to me. When you surrender, you step into divine rest. You step into supernatural peace. You step into a life where you no longer have to figure everything out because you are being led by the one who already has the answers. Think about the Israelites when they were leaving Egypt. God was leading them to the promised land, but they had to go through the wilderness first. And in that wilderness, they had a choice: trust God or complain, surrender or resist. And many of them chose to resist. They doubted, they murmured, they wanted to go back to the very place God had delivered them from. And because of their lack of surrender, an 11-day journey turned into 40 years of wandering. How many blessings have we delayed because we refuse to trust God? How many breakthroughs have we postponed because we are trying to do things our way instead of surrendering to his way? Right now, there is a moment before you, a moment to say, Lord, I surrender. I let go of my plans, my fears, my doubts, my worries. I trust you. I believe that what you have for me is greater than what I could ever plan for myself. When you surrender like that, heaven moves. When you surrender like that, things begin to shift. When you surrender like that, you align yourself with the divine purpose God has set before you. And when you align with his purpose, nothing can stop what He has ordained for your life. When you truly surrender, you release the need to have all the answers. You release the constant worry about how things will turn out. You stop questioning whether God will come through and start resting in the assurance that He already has everything worked out. Surrender is not passive. It is an act of deep trust. It is saying, God, even when I don't see it, I believe you are working. Even when I don't understand, I trust that your plan is greater than mine. That is where the peace that surpasses all understanding begins to guard your heart and mind. That is where you stop living in fear and start walking in faith. Look at Abraham. God told him to leave his homeland and go to a place He would show him. No map, no details, no clear path, just a call to trust. And Abraham obeyed, not knowing where he was going, but believing in the one who called him. That is surrender. He didn't ask for guarantees. He didn't demand to see the whole picture. He simply walked in faith, and because of that surrender, he became the father of many nations. What if he had refused? What if he had stayed where he was, unwilling to step into the unknown? He would have missed the fulfillment of God's promise. And many of us are in that same place, standing at the edge of something greater, but afraid to step forward because we don't have all the details. But God is saying, trust me, walk by faith, not by sight. Some of you have been trying to hold on to something God has been asking you to release. A relationship, a habit, a plan, a mindset, something that feels comfortable but is no longer aligned with God's will for your life. And the longer you hold on, the heavier it becomes. The longer you resist, the more you struggle. But freedom comes when you surrender. When you say, God, I don't understand why you're asking me to let this go, but I trust that you see what I cannot see. Surrender is about trusting the heart of God even when you don't understand His hand. It is about believing that if He is asking you to lay something down, it is only because He has something greater ahead. Think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The weight of what was ahead was heavy. He knew the suffering that was coming. He knew the pain, the rejection, the sacrifice. And yet He surrendered. He said, not my will, but yours be done. And because of that surrender, salvation came to the world. If Jesus had resisted, if He had chosen His own comfort over His Father's will, we would not have the redemption we have today. But His surrender brought victory. And the same is true for you. When you surrender, victory follows. When you lay down your will for His, breakthrough comes. When you release control, you make room for God's supernatural power to move in your life. There are some things in your life right now that you have been trying to fix on your own. You have been strategizing, trying to work things out in your own strength, stressing over how things will come together. But God is saying, let go, let me handle it. The moment you surrender is the moment you invite divine intervention. The moment you stop trying to figure everything out is the moment God steps in and does what only He can do. Surrender is not about giving up. It is about giving it to God. It is about placing everything in His hands and trusting that He will take care of it in ways you never could. Some of you are in a waiting season and you are growing weary. You've been faithful. You've been praying. You've been holding on. But it feels like nothing is changing. And the temptation is to step ahead of God, to force things to happen, to try to make your own way. But hear this, the waiting season is not wasted. God is not delaying. He is preparing. And when you surrender to His timing, you position yourself for His best. Look at David. He was anointed as king, but he didn't step into the throne immediately. There was a process. There were battles. There was preparation. And in that waiting, he had to trust God's timing. What if he had tried to take the throne by force? What if he had refused to wait? He would have missed the fullness of what God had for him. Some of you have been asking God for direction, but you haven't yet surrendered your own plans. You want Him to lead you, but you are still holding on to your own expectations. And God is saying, if you will surrender your plans, I will give you my purpose. If you will release what you think is best, I will give you what is greater. Proverbs 3:5 and 6 tells us to trust in the Lord with all our heart and not lean on our own understanding. That means surrendering our logic, our reasoning, our own way of doing things, and fully relying on His wisdom. God is not asking you to have everything figured out. He is asking you to surrender. He is not requiring you to be perfect. He is asking you to trust Him. He is not looking for people who have all the answers. He is looking for people who have a willing heart. And when you surrender, you make room for the miraculous. When you surrender, you open the door for blessings you never expected. When you surrender, you step into the flow of God's divine plan, where every step is ordered, every provision is prepared, and every battle is already won. There is a freedom that comes with surrender, a peace that the world cannot give, a confidence that even when things don't make sense, you are exactly where you need to be because God is leading the way. Some of you have been fighting for control, holding on to things that are no longer meant for you, resisting the shift God is trying to bring into your life. And today He is asking, will you trust me? Will you lay it down? Will you surrender? The moment you do, everything changes. The weight lifts. The fear fades. The uncertainty no longer paralyzes you because you know that your life is in the hands of the one who never fails. Some of you have been afraid to take the next step because you don't see the whole path. But God never promised to show you the whole road. He promised to be your guide. He promised that He would never leave you. He promised that He would go before you and make the crooked places straight. But you must surrender to the process. There are things in your life right now that you don't understand. Prayers that seem unanswered. Doors that remain closed. But could it be that God is protecting you from something you cannot see? Could it be that what feels like a delay is actually divine redirection? Could it be that what you thought was rejection was actually God's way of making room for something better? When you surrender, you begin to see that everything has purpose, even the closed doors. Even the disappointments, even the moments that don't make sense. Because God is not just working on your situation. He is working on you. He is refining you. He is preparing you. He is shaping you for the blessing that is ahead. Look at Job. He lost everything, his wealth, his health, his family. But even in his suffering, he refused to turn away from God. He surrendered to God's sovereignty. And because of that, God restored everything he had lost, and even more. What if he had given up? What if he had turned his back on God in the middle of his pain? He would have never seen the double portion blessing that was waiting on the other side. And for many of you, the breakthrough is on the other side of your surrender. The blessing is on the other side of your trust. The open door is waiting, but God is asking, will you trust me? Will you let go? Will you surrender? This is not just about one moment of surrender. It is a daily decision. Every day choosing to trust Him. Every day choosing to lay down your will for His. Every day saying, God, I may not understand, but I trust you. I may not see the full picture, but I know you are leading me. I may not have all the answers, but I know that you are in control. And when you live a surrendered life, you live a life of peace, a life of purpose, a life where miracles become normal because you are fully aligned with the will of God. The moment you surrender is the moment heaven moves. The moment you surrender is the moment the impossible becomes possible. The moment you surrender is the moment you step into the destiny God has prepared for you since the beginning of time. Surrender is not a moment, it is a lifestyle. It is a daily decision to trust that God's ways are higher than ours, that His plans are greater than anything we could imagine. When you truly surrender, you release fear, anxiety, and the need for control, and you step into the peace that comes from knowing your life is in the hands of a faithful God. Abraham walked in surrender, and he became the father of many nations. Jesus surrendered in Gethsemane, and He brought salvation to the world. Every great move of God in Scripture came through someone who chose to surrender. Today, God is calling you to lay down the burden of trying to figure everything out, to stop wrestling with what only He can fix, to trust Him even when you don't understand. If you surrender, He will move. If you trust Him, He will lead you. If you let go, He will bring you into the fullness of His plan. The breakthrough you seek is on the other side of your surrender. Lift your hands, open your heart, and say, Lord, I surrender. Continue the good work you've started in me. and watch as he does exceedingly abundantly more than you could ever ask or imagine.